On the morning of October 26, 1924, a chemical worker named Ernest Olgert woke up screaming. He was inside a hospital in Manhattan, strapped to a bed, and he was certain the room was full of people who wanted to kill him. There were no people. There was only Ernest, thrashing against the restraints, shouting at figures that did not exist. By the next day, he was dead. He was 31 years old, and he had spent his last working weeks inside a building at the Standard Oil Refinery in Bygone, New Jersey, where the men who worked there had a private nickname for the place. They called it the Looney Gas Building. Within a few days, 4 more of his co-workers were dead. Dozens of others were carried out of that plant, shaking, hallucinating. Some of them wrestled into straitjackets. The newspapers ran the story on the front page. And the substance that did this to them, the thing they had been handling with their bare hands, was an additive that one quiet, cheerful chemist in Ohio had invented to make car engines run a little more smoothly. He believed it was one of the great gifts of modern science. He believed he was helping. His name was Thomas Midgley Jr., and the strangest part of this story is not that he was a villain. The strangest part is that he almost certainly was not. So how does one well-meaning man end up connected to the poisoning of nearly every human being alive, and then, years later, to a hole in the sky itself? That is the question we are going to answer. Let us start with who he actually was, because the cartoon version of this man, the mad scientist cackling over his poisons, is wrong, and the truth is far more unsettling. Thomas Midgley Jr. was born on May 18, 1889, in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. He came from a family of tinkerers. His father held patents on automobile tires. His grandfather had invented a kind of saw blade. Young Thomas grew up assuming that a clever man with a problem in front of him could simply solve it, the way you might solve a puzzle on a rainy afternoon. He studied mechanical engineering at Cornell University and graduated in 1911. By every account, he was charming, funny, a man who loved a good limerick and a good experiment in roughly equal measure. People liked him. That matters, because likable men are trusted, and trust is what made everything that followed possible. In 1916, he went to work for a research operation that would soon belong to General Motors, under a boss who would shape the rest of his life. That boss was Charles Kettering, one of the most famous inventors in America at the time, the man who had given the automobile its electric starter so that drivers no longer had to crank the engine by hand. Kettering ran a laboratory in Dayton, Ohio, and he had a problem he wanted solved. The problem had a sound. It was a sharp metallic rattle that came out of car engines when they worked hard, a knocking, pinging noise that engineers simply called knock. Knock was not just annoying. It wasted fuel, it limited how powerful an engine could be, and over time it could tear a motor apart. Solve knock, and you could build cars that were faster, more efficient, and cheaper to run. There was a fortune waiting for whoever did it. Kettering handed the job to Midgley. What followed was years of grinding, frustrating work, and this is the part that gets left out of the simple story. Midgley did not stumble onto poison by accident on a lazy afternoon. He hunted for the answer the long, hard way. Starting around 1916, with a break for the First World War, he and his team tested compound after compound, hundreds of them, searching for something that could be added to gasoline to silence that knock. They tried iodine. They tried aniline, which worked, but smelled so foul that no driver would ever tolerate it. They tried a substance called tellurium, which also worked, and which had the unfortunate side effect of making everyone who handled it reek of garlic so powerfully that Midgley's own wife reportedly made him sleep in a separate part of the house. For a while he chased a theory based on the color red, convinced the answer lay with red dyes, which turned out to be a complete dead end. He was, by his own cheerful admission, often wrong. One writer later said, he had an instinct for the regrettable that was almost uncanny, but he kept going. Then, on December 9, 1921, The team added a small amount of a compound called tetraethyl lead to the fuel and started the test engine. The knock vanished. Completely. Just a trickle of this stuff, a tiny fraction of the gasoline, and the engine ran smooth and quiet and strong. Midgley had found it. After all those years, he had the answer in a bottle, and the answer was lead. Now, here is the thing that makes this whole story so heavy. They knew. Lead was not a mystery poison in 1921. Human beings had understood that lead was dangerous for literally thousands of years. The ancient Romans had noticed it. Doctors in the 1800s wrote about lead poisoning in painters and plumbers and factory workers. The word for it, plumbism, was in the medical textbooks. Midgley himself knew the danger early and directly, because handling the concentrated compound made him sick. In January of 1923, he wrote in a letter that his lungs had been affected and that he was going to need to get a large supply of fresh air. He took a long vacation to Miami to recover. He had personally felt this substance reaching into his body, and the project went forward anyway. Why? Partly because the money was simply staggering. General Motors and the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, the ancestor of today's Exxon, formed a joint company in 1924 to manufacture and sell the additive, and they made a careful, telling decision about what to call it. They did not call it leaded gasoline. They did not put the word lead anywhere on it, because they understood perfectly well that the public would recoil from buying poison to pour into the family car. Instead, they named it ethyl. Just ethyl. Clean, modern, harmless sounding. You would pull into a station and ask for a tank of ethyl, and you would have no idea you were asking for lead. That single act of naming tells you that the people behind this knew exactly what they were hiding, and from the very beginning they chose to hide it. The cover story was built into the brand. There was also a road not taken, and it makes the whole thing worse. The chemists already knew that ordinary grain alcohol, ethanol, the same thing in a bottle of liquor, could be blended into gasoline to reduce knock too. It was not as cheap or as potent in small doses, but it worked, and it was not a deadly neurotoxin. The problem with alcohol, from a business point of view, was that nobody could own it. You cannot patent a substance that farmers can ferment from corn in a backyard still. Tetraethyl lead, on the other hand, was a specific manufactured compound that the company could control and license and collect a royalty on every single gallon. The safer answer made no one rich. The dangerous one was a license to print money, and so the dangerous one won. That choice came due in the autumn of 1924, in the bodies of the men who made the stuff. We have already met the workers at Bygone, but they were not the first. Across the river, at a DuPont plant in Deepwater, New Jersey, the same compound had already been killing people. Workers there had given their building its own nickname, an even eerier one than loony gas. Because the lead poisoning caused hallucinations, men who breathed the fumes would sometimes swat at insects that were not there, at imaginary winged things fluttering around their heads. So the men started calling the place the House of Butterflies. Beginning in September of 1923, DuPont workers started to die. The first was a 37-year-old process operator named Frank Durr, who had given a quarter-century of his life to the company. By the time the dying slowed, somewhere around 8 men were dead at Deepwater, and historians count roughly 15 deaths in total across the different plants in those early years, with dozens, possibly hundreds more, left with tremors and ruined minds and damage that never healed. The exact tally is still debated, in part because the companies were not eager to keep careful public records of it. When Bygone exploded into the headlines, the company did not retreat. It did the opposite. It sent out its star. Just days after those men died raving, on October 30th, 1924, Thomas Midgley Jr. himself stood in front of a room of newspaper reporters to prove that tetraethyl lead was perfectly safe. And what he did in that room is one of the most chilling demonstrations in the history of public relations. He picked up a container of the pure compound and poured it over his hands, washing in it as if it were soap. Then he raised a bottle of it to his face and inhaled the fumes deeply, for a full 60 seconds, and calmly told the reporters that he could do this every single day and suffer no harm at all. It was a lie, and he knew it was a lie while he was doing it, because he was at that very moment a man who had already been poisoned by this same chemical. He had needed his own escape to Florida to recover. Some accounts say that not long after this performance, he again had to step away from his work to deal with the effects of lead on his body. He stood there, breathing poison into his own lungs for show, asking the public to trust him, while he himself was living proof that the stuff was dangerous. Whether you call that a cover-up or a kind of desperate self-deception, the result was the same. The reassuring image went out across the country. The trusted, smiling expert had shown everyone there was nothing to fear. For a moment, it looked like the truth might win. The city of New York banned the sale of leaded gasoline. New Jersey and Philadelphia took action too. In May of 1925, the United States Surgeon General called a national conference in Washington to weigh the danger, and the company suspended sales while it was studied. Scientists like Alice Hamilton, a pioneer in industrial medicine, stood up and warned that this was a slow, invisible poison, that lead would build up quietly in the bodies of ordinary people over years, and that you could not measure that kind of harm by checking whether a healthy worker dropped dead in a single afternoon. She was right. But the conference was rushed. The deep, long-term studies that should have taken years to run properly were never done. The committee concluded that there was no good reason to prohibit the sale, provided the manufacturing was handled more carefully. By 1926, leaded gasoline was back, and this time, it would stay for the better part of a century. The window had closed. And here is where the story stops being about a few dozen workers in New Jersey and becomes about you. Because once that decision was made, leaded gasoline did not stay in the factory. It went into hundreds of millions of cars, all over the planet, for roughly 60 years. And every one of those cars burned that fuel and blew microscopic particles of lead out of the tailpipe and into the open air, into the air over cities, into the air children breathed on their way to school. The lead settled into the soil along every roadway, into household dust, into the food supply, into the water. It did not break down. It did not go away. It accumulated, year after year, in the bones and blood of nearly everyone alive. By the time it was finally banned, scientists could measure the lead from car exhaust in the ice of Greenland and in the snow of Antarctica, thousands of miles from any highway. This was not local pollution anymore. Midgley's invention had quietly contaminated the entire surface of the Earth. For a long time, almost no one connected the dots. And that was no accident either. The industry funded its own scientist, a doctor named Robert Kehoe, who for decades served as the authoritative voice insisting that the lead in people's bodies was natural and normal and nothing to worry about. The burden of proof in his framework fell on anyone who wanted to claim harm, and the studies that might have proven it kept not getting funded. The man who finally broke that wall was a geochemist named Claire Patterson. He had not set out to fight anyone. He had been trying to measure the age of the Earth by studying lead in ancient rocks, and to do it he had to build some of the cleanest laboratories ever made, because he kept finding that lead contamination was everywhere, ruining his samples. That puzzle led him to a disturbing conclusion. He compared lead deep in old layers of the ocean and old layers of polar ice with lead near the surface, and the difference was enormous. In 1965, he published his findings. Modern humans, he showed, were carrying something like 100 times more lead in their bodies than our ancestors had. This was not natural. This was us. This was the gasoline. Patterson paid a price for saying so. He lost research contracts. The lead industry pushed to keep him off government advisory panels. The same playbook that had worked in 1925, smile, reassure, fund a friendly expert, fund nothing that might contradict him, was used against him for years. But this time the truth had a foothold, and slowly, painfully, the evidence piled up too high to push aside. Lead, it turned out, did its worst damage to the very young. It quietly lowered children's intelligence. It was linked to learning disabilities, to behavioral problems, to attention disorders. The United States finally began phasing leaded gasoline out of ordinary cars in the 1980s, with the ban on road vehicles taking hold in 1986, and the last of it cleared out by 1996. Much of the rest of the world followed, though some countries kept selling it well into the 21st century. When researchers later went back and tried to add up the damage, the numbers were almost too large to feel. One widely reported study estimated that childhood exposure to lead from gasoline cost Americans, as a population, on the order of 800 million points of IQ, lowering the intelligence of much of an entire generation by a measurable amount. More than half of all Americans alive today were exposed as children to levels of lead now considered dangerous. Worldwide, health organizations have linked lead exposure to enormous numbers of premature deaths each year, from the heart disease and other illnesses that lead quietly drives. Some scientists go further and argue that the lead in the air may even be tied to the great wave of violent crime that rose and then fell in the second half of the 20th century. The idea being that a generation poisoned in childhood grew up with more impulsive and aggressive behavior, and that crime dropped a couple of decades after the lead was removed. That last connection is still argued over, and honest researchers will tell you it is a correlation, not a proven cause. But even setting it aside, the toll on human health and human minds is staggering, and it was carried, in part, on the back of one man's clever little additive. Here is the part of the story that should have made any reasonable person stop, take stock, and conclude that maybe this particular chemist should not be handed any more world-changing inventions to play with. Instead, the opposite happened. Thomas Midgley Jr., by now a celebrated figure, the man who had conquered engine knock, was simply pointed at the next big problem, and he solved it just as brilliantly and just as catastrophically. The new problem was the refrigerator. In the late 1920s, the machines that kept food cold and cooled buildings ran on gases that were genuinely dangerous in a different way. They used substances like ammonia, methyl chloride, and sulfur dioxide, all of which were toxic or flammable, or both. Refrigerators sometimes leaked, and when they did, people in their own kitchens were poisoned in their sleep. There were deadly accidents, so the industry wanted a miracle gas, something that could move heat the way these chemicals did, but that would not burn and would not poison anyone if it leaked. Once again, Midgley took the job. Once again, working with a colleague named Albert Henne, he searched, and within a remarkably short time he found it. He built a new family of compounds out of carbon, chlorine, and fluorine. The world would come to know them as chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, and the most famous brand name for them would be Freon. And on this one, judged by everything anyone could measure at the time, he had genuinely succeeded. The new gas was a marvel. It was not flammable, it was not toxic to breathe, it would not poison a family in their kitchen. It was, by the standards of 1930, about as safe a chemical as you could possibly ask for, and in fact, it would save real lives by replacing the deadly old refrigerants. Midgley was so proud and so confident that in 1930, he gave another one of his showman demonstrations, this time in front of a meeting of the American Chemical Society. He filled his lungs with the new vapor, and then he slowly breathed it out across a lit candle. The gas was harmless to him, and as it washed over the flame, it smothered it, the candle going dark. There, in one elegant gesture, he had shown the world that his new creation neither poisoned nor burned. This time, unlike the lead, it was not a deception. He really did believe, with good reason, that he had made something wonderful. Freon went everywhere. It went into refrigerators and freezers and air conditioners. It went into the spray cans of the second half of the century, propelling hairspray and deodorant and paint out of millions of aerosol bottles. It cooled homes and hospitals and grocery stores. It made the modern, climate-controlled, food-preserving world possible. For more than 40 years, it sat there in the background of ordinary life, doing its quiet, useful work, and the very thing that made it seem so perfectly safe, the fact that it was so stable, so unreactive, so unwilling to break down or harm anything, was the exact property that would eventually turn it into a planetary disaster. Because a gas that refuses to break down does not just disappear when it leaks, it rises. In 1974, two chemists, Mario Molina and Sherwood Rowland, working at a university in California, sat down and asked a question nobody had bothered to ask. If we are pumping out millions of tons of these incredibly stable CFC gases, and they never break apart down here, then where do they actually go? They worked it out. The gases drift slowly upward, over years, all the way into the upper atmosphere. And up there, high above the clouds, the harsh ultraviolet light from the sun finally does what nothing on the ground could do. It rips the molecules apart and frees the chlorine atoms locked inside them. And a single freed chlorine atom, they calculated, could go on to destroy ozone, the thin layer of gas high overhead that shields every living thing on the surface from the sun's most damaging radiation. Worse, one chlorine atom did not just destroy one piece of ozone and stop. It acted like a catalyst, tearing apart one ozone molecule after another, tens of thousands of them, in a chain reaction. The very chemical that had been chosen, precisely because it was harmless and inert, was, far above our heads, quietly dismantling the planet's sunscreen. At first it was only a calculation, a frightening hypothesis on paper, and plenty of people in the chemical industry called it alarmism. Then, in 1985, a team of British scientists in Antarctica, led by Joseph Farman, found the proof in the sky. Over the bottom of the world, the ozone layer had thinned so dramatically that they could measure a vast gap in it. The newspapers called it the ozone hole. The thing Molina and Rowland had warned about was real, and it was already here, opening up over the South Pole every spring. A thinner ozone layer means more ultraviolet radiation reaching the ground, and that means more skin cancer, more cataracts, more harm to crops, and to the tiny ocean life at the base of the entire food chain. For the first time, humanity had managed to damage not just a city or a river, but the protective shell of the whole planet, and an enormous share of it traced back to a substance one man had invented in an Ohio laboratory to keep the milk from spoiling. This time, to the world's credit, people moved faster. The discovery of the ozone hole frightened governments into doing something rare. In 1987, nations came together and signed an agreement called the Montreal Protocol, a binding international promise to phase out the production of CFCs and the other chemicals eating the ozone. It is often called the single most successful environmental treaty ever made. The ozone layer, slowly, over decades, began to heal, and scientists today believe it is on track to recover. Molina and Rowland, the men who sounded the alarm, shared the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1995. The damage was real and serious, but it was caught in time, and the catching of it stands as proof that we can, when we are scared enough, undo our own mistakes. Both of Midgley's great gifts to mankind, the lead and the Freon, would eventually have to be hunted down and banned, at vast effort and cost, decades after he was gone. But Midgley did not live to see any of it. He never learned that his fuel was poisoning the bones of every child in America. He never learned that his refrigerant was carving a hole in the sky. He died in 1944, and the manner of his death is the final, unbearable twist in a life already overflowing with them. In 1940, at the age of 51, Thomas Midgley Jr. caught polio. The disease left him severely disabled, his legs all but useless, his body weak. And here the inventor in him could not help but respond to a problem the way he always had, by building a clever device to solve it. Lying in his bed, unable to lift himself, he designed an elaborate system of ropes and pulleys and a harness, a contraption that could hoist him up and turn him, and help him get in and out of bed without depending on other people. It was, in its way, a small and very Midgley solution, a man with a problem reaching for a gadget. On the morning of November 2, 1944, that machine killed him. He was found tangled in his own ropes, strangled by the very device he had built to help himself. He was 55 years old. For a long time, the story was told as the ultimate dark irony, the great inventor undone by one final invention, killed by his own cleverness, in a way that felt almost like the universe settling a debt. But the truth may be sadder and simpler than that. The coroner ruled the death a suicide. We will probably never know for certain what happened in that room, whether it was a genuine accident with the pulleys or the deliberate act of a sick and exhausted man. What we do know is that the inventions Midgley left behind would go on killing and damaging long after he was in the ground, on a scale he could not have imagined and was never forced to face. So what do we do with a man like Thomas Midgley Jr.? It is tempting to make him a monster, but that is the easy way out, and it lets the rest of us off the hook. The hard truth is that he was, by all accounts, a decent, brilliant, well-liked man who genuinely believed at almost every step that he was making the world better, safer, more comfortable. With the lead, yes, there was a lie, a cover-up, a smiling deception in front of reporters, and that part deserves no mercy. But with the Freon, there was no villainy at all. There was only a clever solution that did exactly what it was asked to do, and then quietly did something nobody knew to ask about. One historian put it about as bluntly as it can be put. He said that Thomas Midgley Jr. had more impact on the atmosphere of the Earth than any other single organism in the history of the planet. Not the most evil, the most impact. A man who, by trying to help, may have caused more harm to more people than almost anyone who ever lived. And that is the part that should stay with you, because it is not really a story about one strange chemist at all. It is a story about how the worst damage often comes wrapped as progress. It comes from confident, capable people solving real problems, doing what looks for all the world like good, with consequences that hide for decades inside the slow chemistry of the body and the air. The men who poured ethyl into their tanks thought they were buying a better drive. The families who finally got a refrigerator that would not poison them in their sleep thought they were buying safety, and in a sense, they were. The catch never announces itself. It waits. So the next time someone in a clean coat and a calm voice promises you that something new is perfectly safe, that the experts have looked into it, that there is nothing at all to worry about, remember the man who washed his hands in poison to prove a point, and remember the gas that put out a candle and then went up to put a hole in the sky. Ask the question they did not. Sometimes the most dangerous words in the world are spoken by someone who truly believes he is helping. If stories like this one, the forgotten ones that still shape the air you breathe, are the kind you want more of, subscribe and stay with us.